and also to produce it. And it was called The End of the Century. Shall we hope or shall we die? I'm pretty sure that the library here has that film. It's one of those big old-fashioned films, and then it was put in other formats. But anyway, and I'm on there as a young sprout. But anyway, one of the things we did in the program was to go to interview Malcolm Muggeridge, who lived in South London in a beautiful little village. I don't know if you know the name Malcolm Muggeridge, but he was a very prominent television personality at that time in Great Britain and here too, but particularly in Great Britain, who had converted to Christianity as an adult man. Anyway, we went to talk to him as a social critic, and spent the whole day with him. On the film, he's only on about maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but and with me was Batsell Barrett Baxter. Some of you in Pepperdine may know that name because his father was the first president of Pepperdine. He was a celebrity as well at that time. I can't start telling stories about this, but I went to, and we filmed some in Chicago. He and I went to a Cubs game, and we could hardly watch the game for people going to come up and get his autograph and talk to him and everything. I didn't realize he was that well known, but anyway, we talked to Malcolm Muggeridge about a lot of things. But one of the questions we asked him was, we said, if Jesus had come in our time instead of in the first century, do you think he would have used television as a way to get his message out to the people? And Malcolm Muggeridge said, never. And now Malcolm Muggeridge was known for being on TV all the time. And I said, really? He said, no. I said, well, why would you say that Jesus would never use television? He said, because you cannot tell the truth on television. You can't, it is impossible to tell the truth. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He says, because television is a visual art in which the cameraman is deciding what you see, and he's making selections that are going to determine what the truth is for you, not what the truth necessarily really is. He said, for example, if he wants to make you think there's a huge crowd there, he just shows a lot of people in the picture and doesn't show all the empty seats. Or if he wants to make it look like nobody came to hear you, he just shows the empty seats. He says he's got to make decisions that are going to distort the truth. And therefore, he said, I just can't see Jesus getting himself in a situation where he has to distort the truth. Well, anyway, I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten that whole day. I think we also have an audio tape of spending the day with him that I think also maybe the Pepperdine Library has too. I'm not sure. But because we talked about a lot of things. But anyway, the camera chooses what you see. Now, where I'm going with this, I want to talk to you about two things. History, what the genre of a history is. And I also want to talk about epic. And then we might put them together and talk about what is an epic history. But just to paint with a very broad brush, I hear a lot about objective history, or someone is not writing objective history, or somebody is, or all history should be objective. And I'm always a little bit amused by that, because there's no such thing as objective history. It's like the TV cameraman. A historian is making thousands of choices when they sit down to write a history. Now you could just write down everything, but I think that's just called life. Life hits us that way. Just thousands of things happen to us every day. But when you sit down to write something, you have to decide which parts are you going to write, and then even more significantly, why. So the very idea of writing a history is it has to be based on a high level of selectivity. And so I know it's hard to give up, but we just have to give up the idea of objective history. And then when you read a history book, you're getting an objective view of what happened, let's say, in the Civil War. I want to tell you billions of things happened in the Civil War, and no historian's ever written more than a few thousand of them when he sat down to write his book. And he had some system in his mind for what he wrote down and what he didn't. And so it kind of becomes his history, not necessarily the history. You get my point here. So, quote, history, unquote, selects from events. And that it selects from events based on a predetermined narrative, a predetermined story. And that's always done, and it's always done with all histories. And we thankfully have, by the way, a passage in the Bible where a biblical writer explains that process. I just want to read briefly here. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write in an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke says that he had a mass of information, and he selected on what basis? He picked the things that help you to be confident of what you had been taught. And so he's simply saying what all historians say when they set out to write history. Yes.
Well, it's just like somebody is an editor. They're editing what's happened.
That's,
Write it down.
that's right. That's right. And that process goes on. It goes on all the time. And the reason I bring it up here is because you've got to read a lot of the Bible. A lot of sections in the Bible are history, all right? They are history in, like all histories that can be described just the way I just did. The writer sits down with a mass of information and with a predetermined narrative. And then he uses the information to explain that narrative to the reader. This is what historians do. Now, I don't mean to say that what they're saying is not accurate. There is such a thing as writing putting down things that are inaccurate. There's also such a thing as having a false narrative. That's why you have to be really careful, even with what's supposedly an objective history, because what you really have to be looking for all the time is, what is the historian's narrative? Because the narrative might be all wrong, and consequently, he could have all the facts might be right. The history might still not be valuable because the narrative is not correct. So this makes it a little harder to read history than we'd sometimes like to do. The events, therefore, that a historian uses illustrate his narrative. He's not just writing down everything he knows about something. First thing you ever learned, the first term paper you ever wrote, I hope you learned this, was that you had a lot more information than you could use, and you had to start selecting on some basis. I hope you had a lot more information than you could use.
Also, when the record is also biased, there are certain key information the
Yeah.
audience won't be able to get. Because there's a story I found, and I didn't find it in the Holy Bible, that was Joseph. I read it. What happened when he took 45 wives? And I read in another historical Jewish article, and I was so fascinated. How come these writers that wrote the Holy Bible, why did they put the key factor was in the Bible, the plot, because the plot was very, very, very significant.
Yeah, well, and in fact, you raised the word bias. What we tend to do is to say a historian is biased if we don't agree with his narrative, and that he's a good historian if we do. But maybe that's enough. Anyway, we can talk a lot about that, but it's. I just want to make that point because I want you to realize that when you read a historical section in the Bible, you're not reading a diary, all right, where somebody's just putting down everything that happened to them that day, even though diaries are very selective, according to what you think is significant about that day. You're not doing that. One of the first things you need to be looking for is what is the perspective or the narrative of the writer. All right. And so is the Old Testament historical? That we've been arguing for centuries, but particularly in modern times, about whether the Bible is accurate historically. Now, let me say this. I want to be very careful what I say here. There is an immense amount of objective historical facts in the Bible. I spent a lot of my career working with archaeology, and something that archaeology has shown over and over and over and over again is that when the Bible describes a battle or a city or some geographical thing, it's better for you as an archaeologist or as a historian to accept that as true than to question it. Not that many things in the Bible have been questioned. I remember that old Broadway song, it ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. You remember that old, I'm looking at you and you're thinking, what's he talking about? Well, anyway, that's an old Broadway song, but yeah. Anyway, and so for years, believers and unbelievers have been at one another over whether everything in the Bible is so. And what people mean by that is it a bit of objective historical information. But the point I want to make to you today is a historian is correct or incorrect, not necessarily because everything in his book that he's got it exactly like it happened. After all, if you're writing the history of the Roman Empire, you weren't around. And you have to go sometimes with you don't have all of the facts. And some of the facts you have not reached us in an entirely well-formed way. But you can still either be right or wrong in your history of the Roman Empire. You follow me? The right or wrong question has to do with the narrative. It does not have to do with the illustrations of the narrative. I'm not saying there are mistakes in the Bible. I'm saying be very careful about claiming there are mistakes in the Bible. Be very careful about that. But the narrative of the Bible is true or not true, quite apart from how you feel about any particular detail that's given in the story. So in Joshua, it says there were 10,000 troops, and you think maybe there were only 1,000. Okay, you can argue about that, and we can all argue about that, and so on. But the question is, what is the book of Joshua trying to say? And is that a powerful message about the action of God in the life of in our lives as human beings? See what I mean? Be looking for the narrative, be looking for the point. And I don't know, all the time we've wasted, generation after generation, arguing about the accuracy of a particular statement or a particular event. As I say, I always start with the premise, yes, it's true. The event is true, that the history is accurate. And I always wonder when somebody says it isn't, exactly what degree did they get or what test did they pass to be able to say that? It's pretty arrogant sometimes. But my point is, even if that is true, it does not speak to the truth of the narrative. Okay, enough on that. Now let's talk a little bit about epics. Okay. I looked up again. I told you last week, I've been looking things up on the internet to find the real truth. And I find that an epic is one in which the characters are beings of national importance and they have historical or legendary significance. We'll talk about legend in a minute. And the setting is grand in scope, covering nations, the world, or even the universe, and the action consists of deeds of great valor and courage. And there are a number, particularly in the Old Testament, there are a number of sections that I'm pretty well describing what you just heard there. The possible exception of the word legend, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. Now I want to talk a little bit about the word myth. Sadly, for the word myth, it lives in bad company. Somewhere along the line, the word myth in English has been used to describe something that in its essence is not true. You know, when you say, that's just a myth. You said something bad about that. Did George Washington really, is that story about cutting down the cherry tree, is that true? Or is that just a myth? So you make this contrast. That's very unfortunate because that's not the essential meaning of the word myth, which does not make any judgment about whether a story is historically true or not. A myth may or may not be historically true, but the truth of the myth has nothing to do with the history behind the myth. And this is so hard to explain, particularly hard to explain in just a little bit of time. But a myth is a symbolic narrative. We'll be talking about parables later. A parable is a symbolic story. It doesn't really matter whether the guy in the myth really buried 10 talents or not. You know, that's not an essential part of the truth of the story. Well, myths are like that. They seem to relate to actual events, but often the time that they occur is unspecified. Not exactly sure when that happened. And the things that happen in the myth are not the things that happen in ordinary human experience. But neither of those things have anything to do with whether the myth is conveying something that's essentially and very, very true. And so I want to be very careful, and I know somebody somewhere is getting me on tape, but I'm finally at the age and situation in my life where I spent most of my life caring a great deal about that. I don't really care anymore. Okay. So somebody's going to go say, John said in Sunday school that part of the Bible is mythological. Okay, but did you just hear what I said? I didn't say it wasn't true. Okay. I just said you have to read some things. It's a different literary form. It's a different genre. I think of two questions that you can really only explain by telling a myth, not an untrue myth, a myth. And one of them is, how did the world get here? How did we all get here? See, that's an unspecified time in an unspecified place, and characters that are heroic. And I mean, I can go through all of those things I just said. And so there it is. How did the world begin? Why do human beings not live in paradise right now? Why is that? You've wondered that, have you not? Why has the world got all these sort of lousy things going on? Couldn't we have a better place by now? And so, you can tell a story, and it can be a true story that will explain that, even though that's totally outside of normal human experience. I mean, we're not normally somewhere where there's snakes talking to us and the God of the universe is walking in the garden and so on, are we? And yet, am I saying the story of Adam and Eve is not true? No, I am not. I fervently believe that nothing could be truer. Okay. So I use the word myth not to mean something that's not true, but to mean something that deals with a question that so surmounts our usual life experience, that it's really true. Okay. Myths and epics transcend an accumulation of facts. Not only can they be as true as just an indiscriminate list of facts, like the phone book, where every number is correct, if it is, and if you've ever seen a phone book, by the way, those of you who are younger. But everything in there may be true, but it doesn't really tell you all that much. So sometimes a myth can be a lot more true and indicate a lot more truth than can just a list of facts. Now, biblical history does take place, for the most part, in real time and space. And as I say, archaeology has certainly taught me that. I don't know about the stories of the first part of Genesis. I really don't know. I've been thinking about those for many, many years, decades, and I'm not sure what category to put those in. But they are, I do know that they are mythological in their purpose, in the good sense of myth. That they are to teach us things that ordinary history could never teach us, and truths that we could never understand simply by accumulating a bunch of facts. So all these arguments that I hear about, was the earth created in 7 days and how did we, and so on, I just say, I have personally been driven to myth to get my understanding of that. And I think that that's the way God revealed to us a way to understand those things. But that's kind of just what I think. So anyway, I think I made it.
No, this is great. You did a great job, John.
Thank you very much. I'm going to sit over here and Kylan's going to talk to you.
All right. I'm going to use my laptop a little, or my phone a little bit, because my laptop is currently occupied with Zoom. If you were here last week, I wasn't, because I was doing the NSO Bible class with our first year students. But I asked John if he'd be willing to co-teach with me, because I really wanted to learn from him. Just like all of you, I know, show up regularly to learn from him. And so the chance to not just, sit down, but to also work with him. And we've met a couple times over the summer, and all of that has just been really special. And I feel really honored to be able to do that with you. And so the way that we kind of decided to split up this this class is that he would give you an orientation to each of the genres that we're going to be covering in this class. We're doing an overview of all the genres that are in the Bible. And then I am going to try and apply that with you to some of specific texts through the scriptures. So I will go ahead and pass these out and share these. I only brought 15 because my understanding was that it was more sparse. So go ahead, and if you have a Bible that you would like to use, you can just go ahead and skip this. But these are the two texts that we are going to be using for today. Genesis 32, and I'm going to write them down on the board. Genesis 32, specifically the very last section, starting in, I'm pretty sure it's verse 22, yeah? 22 to 32? Yeah, 32. And then the other one is Exodus. Someone remind me what I did. What's the chapter on the paper? Exodus 11. Thank you. It's the whole thing.
Through 12.
Yeah, it's almost the entire thing. So Exodus 11. It's really difficult. This is one of the most challenging genres to capture small snippets of scripture, to capture a genre that is literally epic. So what we decided to do was to look at two of the most formative stories in the story of God's people. So these are two really important stories. We'll actually start with Genesis. I think I flipped it over when I gave it to you. So we'll start with the shorter passage. This is the story of how Jacob came to be renamed Israel, which is, of course, the very first moment of Israel's existence, right? So this is a very important story. It's relatively short. It's right there on the page. You can see it. It's just a handful of verses, of course, within the context of a grander narrative. But this is a foundational story. I think that's another really important quality of myth, is that it's one of those stories that shapes who we understand ourselves to be. Myths are stories that shape who we understand ourselves to be. So John was talking about Genesis 1 and the difference between Genesis 1 to 3 of what that says about who we are as human beings versus the other competing myths of the other local cultures in the ancient world. In Genesis 1, what we find is a God who loves order, who loves peace, who creates humans to be co-creators, to be beloved children of God, made in God's image. Like, that is a very beautiful image that reveals a lot to us about the character of God. Whereas the competing mythologies of creation of the ancient world, humans were created as slaves to do the dirty work of the gods. The gods loved chaos. The earth wasn't born out of a single word that created peace and life. The earth was born out of war and sometimes really awful things that the gods did to each other. And so those are two competing narratives that say something about who we understand ourselves to be at the most fundamental level. So Genesis 32 is the story of who Israel, who God's people understand themselves to be at the most fundamental level. Of course, this isn't everything. There are many other stories we could point to that also shape the narratives of who we understand ourselves to be as God's people, who Israel understood themselves to be as God's people. And this is the first moment of Israel's existence. The very first moment. This has to matter, right? In an epic way, like in a longevity kind of way. So can someone read it? However, you are only allowed to read it if you read it in an epic voice. You cannot read it in a monotone. Monotones are not allowed when we read historical epics. Go ahead, Patrick, you got it. Everyone listen for what this story communicates about who God is and who we are in light of who God is. Go ahead, Patrick.
The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and set them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. But he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go, unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle.
Thank you, Patrick. That last verse is like one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's like, and this is why we don't eat thighs. I love it. All right, what are some of the things you notice that capture some of those qualities of epic history that John was talking about just a few minutes ago? So for example, major characters.
Man, okay.
Yeah, a weird man who just like appears out of nowhere. And then Jacob, who is one of the patriarchs of Israel, of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So very important historical figure and kind of this mysterious thing that happened. So that also calls out this kind of like abnormal thing that happens, right? This isn't a daily occurrence. Okay, what else? What else stands out as an element of epic history?
There's literally a conflict.
Yeah, there's literally within the story, there's this very epic battle. Like you think of, like, I don't know, if you're like in video games and like playing the boss, right? like that there, it's a transitory moment. It's a moment of transition. It's a moment where you're about to like move on to the next level, for example. So there's this like big moment that is happening. Both within the story, it's like a battle within it, and it's a transition moment in the story of Israel. Yeah. What else do you notice about this story?
It also directly tells us, these are why these 3 things now happen. This is why this place is called this. This is why Jacob is called Israel.
Exactly.
This is why you don't eat the thigh muscle. Like,
yes.
It tells us. It actually tells us like, this is why I'm telling you this story, is to get you to get these 3 things.
Yeah, exactly. It gives some really important context so that Israelites who are reading this story hundreds, maybe even thousands of years later are like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, it traces back to this. This isn't just like a random thing we do. It has this very significant meaning that reminds us of who we are every time we do it. Every time we bypass eating the hip socket or whatever, the thigh, I don't know anatomy. But every time we bypass eating that, like we are reminded of who we are in light of who God is. Like that's pretty cool. What are some details that are left out of the story? Part of history is choosing what to mention and what not to mention. What are some details that are excluded?
The story never says who the man is. I mean, Jacob.
It never
says
clarifies.
that's who he was, but the story doesn't.
Yeah, and Jacob seems to kind of jump to a conclusion unless there's stuff that happened that wasn't reported. So it's like, why do you want to know who I am? He blessed him, vanished, boom, gone. And Jacob's like, I guess it was God. I don't know. like we're not really sure what the details of that were. I don't know. Like it's really bizarre. Yeah.
We can also say why they started fighting. I mean, they meet each other.
Yes.
Maybe it's like a land situation, but it doesn't tell us.
It doesn't tell us how they start fighting. Like I always imagine like Jacob sitting there, like, do I really want to cross this river and go get killed by my brother Esau? And then he's like, I might bolt. And then like he's just like tackled. That's how I imagine it. But we don't know. Like it could be that that he like bumped into someone and they just started like throwing punches. I don't know. Probably didn't punch each other.
Therefore, today's day, the Israelites will not eat the time also that is on the hips of a socket because of so it becomes so generalized in Israel.
Mhm.
But also look at the man.
Right. So Jacob became a prototype of Israel. Jacob becomes representative of all of God's people in this story.
You are the
Yeah. So Jacob is both an individual, a historical individual, and Jacob is Israel as a whole in this story. And in a very literal sense, right? Like he was literally renamed Israel. Like for this moment, he is Israel. And then like Israel becomes the 12 tribes, eventually becomes a nation, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, like that's another way that it's a historical epic in the story. Good. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
Winter, how did he just touch his hip socket? I mean, I feel like that would have to be a pretty strong touch to knock it out of joint.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
sounds like
Totally.
it was quite a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That and even in the name Israel, you have wrestled with God and with humans and have overcome, except you're also going to be permanently injured for the rest of your life. You know, like so yes, we wrestle with God. It's kind of built into the faith and we don't walk away unscathed. What about Israel's name? What does that tell God's people about who we are? Israel.
Israel mean God fight. So I mean, it's pretty. As you just said, I think that was the beginning. That was the fundamental foundation of Israel when Jacob met with God over there. So as you said it, I think.
Yeah, Israel, the one, yeah, struggle.
Because you should be expecting a struggle
Mhm.
God will stop.
Yeah, struggle.
You will be opposed, and then those that are opposed, you probably will struggle with them.
Mm. Yeah, so struggle is kind of built into what it means to follow God in some way. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
I think it seems to be that there's this emphasis on you're human, you have your human relationships, and yet you're also identified with a specific relationship.
Mhm.
and struggle with God.
Yeah, it highlights this covenantal relationship, that's this special interaction between God and God's people. Yeah. Struggle.
And the blessing too.
And the blessing.
Struggle and he prevails and then he's blessed, but he's
Yeah.
still injured. So you're left not chained, you're left unscathed, but also better than you.
But also better than you were. Yes. Yeah. Transformed. Inherently transformed with a permanent reminder of your transformation. Yeah. No, that's really good. And what's interesting there too is like it could be read as the renaming itself is the blessing. It could also be read as like there was a renaming and then he blessed him. And that seems like a really odd detail to leave out to me. That like this primary fundamental blessing, like what were the words? What were the words? What was the blessing? I want to know like what that looked like. And just to say like it happened as a general statement is both beautiful and raises a lot of questions. It makes me want to dig deeper. Any other observations about historical narrative in this historical epic in this particular story? Okay. We don't have an awkward amount of time because I love Genesis 32. It's one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible, for real, not just the last verse. This whole story is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I teach it a lot. So we lingered there a little bit too long, but let's go to Exodus. for a moment at least. The final plague, this is Exodus 11:1, and then the first few verses of chapter 12. And let me think about how we should do this for 10-ish minutes, 15 minutes. How about let's get into small groups? Let's get into small groups of 4 to 5 and go ahead and read it and ask yourselves the same questions that we just explored with Exodus, or that we just explored with Genesis. So go ahead and get in groups of 4 or 5. I'll write some of the questions on the board for you to think about with your group. Go ahead. Oh, I should send the Zoom group into a breakout room. Oh, okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm trying to repeat what everyone's saying because we don't have our major our center of the room mic. So I'm trying to repeat what everyone says as we're doing large classroom discussion. So apologies for that extra delay. I'm going to send you guys out into a breakout room so that you guys can discuss Exodus as well. Exodus 11 to 12:13. So here, I'll type that into the chat. Tim is sending the questions. Exodus. Actually, I guess they could just discuss right here, don't they? Yeah, go ahead and just do it right here. That way you guys don't have to leave. So you can just go ahead and unmute yourselves. The class unfortunately can't hear you. But go ahead and unmute yourselves and talk amongst yourselves if you would like to talk about Exodus 11:1 to 12:13 and some of the ways that it looks like historical epic.
Hi, anybody out there?
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself so that I don't disrupt your conversation.
Is anybody out there?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Kathy. I don't have myself on screen because I look like a tornado hit me this morning.
This is Janet.
Hi, Janet. Wow, what a great class. What does the story teach us about God and humanity and about God's conventional people? Okay.
This is the plague of the firstborn, it looks like.
Wow. Yeah, I guess I really need to read it again. It's verse 11, 1, and then 12. The first
chapter 11, verse 1.
Yeah. There you are. Hi. Now I can see you anyway. Yeah, it's Exodus 11, 1, and then she said it's most of the verses in chapter 12. I'm going to go ahead and crack my Bible open also on screen. So now my poor phone is really overloaded. Is anybody else out there?
Yeah. Jerry, I see Jerry H there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
And David and Betty and Wally.
Yeah,
I'm here.
I wonder if someone should read the passage.
I don't think we have time for that. You got to speed read it.
Okay, I'll get that.
It's chapter 11, verse 1 through 12, the first few verses.
Yeah.
So it's not just one verse.
Yeah. And
I
then,
don't think I realized that beasts were involved, firstborn of all
Absolutely.
beasts.
Yeah, absolutely. The first time I've seen that ever.
I never knew. I mean, somehow I've read over that every time I've ever read it. I didn't know the firstborn of all the beasts.
Well, I've been tempted to, like Tom Jefferson, cut that out of my Bible
Yeah.
because it's kind of hard to explain. but myth does help.
It's just interesting because you know that there were some innocents that suffered.
Yes.
And then chapter 12 describes the ongoing feast of Passover and how that was to be honored. One thing I can see about God is God intends for us to remember.
That's true.
And before this last plague, they had been given time after time after time of the plagues to rescind what their actions and what they were living like. And, you know, in a way, they had been warned and warned and warned. And then this final plague.
But see, the other plagues are natural phenomena that regularly occur in that area. And the real miracle, if there is one, is the timing of them. Now, this one, you can't explain that way. And that may be why it comes to mythical proportions.
Yeah. This is the example of biblical proportions.
Yeah.
It is big.
And you can really wonder, to establish the point that Israel's special, would God really authorize killing all these innocent people?
Well,
for example, in Judges and Joshua, where you got these prophets thinking that God told them to kill every man, woman, and child, I don't believe that. I believe they had a vision that they thought that's what God wanted them to do. But I don't accept that. It doesn't fit. I don't think God changes from Old Testament to New Testament times.
Well, and we assume that our timeline is the only one. In other words, death is permanent and final. And in a way it is, but it's not really the end of the story for innocent people who die. And surely God is bigger than that.
Are we going to get back at some point and see what Fallon has to say?
Yeah.
I don't know what the mechanism for that is.
She'll unmute herself.
Yeah, I think so.
One detail that is left out, when you look at chapter 11, verse 8, it says that he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. And I fail to see exactly when he went into Pharaoh. When was he going into Pharaoh's presence? That detail is not in there.
Yeah. Yep, and he went out in hot anger. So
we have a dialogue between God and Moses. But then in verse 8, it says, he went out. That means Moses went out from Pharaoh in hot anger.
I know there's plenty more to be said about this. Volumes have been written on this chapter. All right, what were some things that stood out to you? We don't have to cover everything as a group, but I'm curious what you noticed. And maybe if you're someone who's really familiar with the Bible, maybe how you engage this story differently, knowing some genre context. What were some things that came up in your conversation? What were some things that surprised you based on engaging this story specifically as a historical epic? Whatever you would like to share.
I mean, it's a really good story. A really good origin.
It has,
like you were passed over, these tragedies happened, you were saved.
Yeah, it's a powerful story to be reminded of every single year at the Passover. And for us, every single year at Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, right? Because that all happened around the Passover. Yes.
The story, I would also picture the story like God was creating a tribunal when he was complaining to Moses, saying, this Pharaoh has been doing to my people,
Mm.
and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And God himself will also say that this is going to be Pharaoh reaction, and I'm going to counteract Pharaoh reaction. So it's like God was trying to justify himself.
Mm. Yeah, I can try and synthesize that. So I'm like, one of the kind of broader ideas I'm hearing from you is that there's this relationship and back and forth dialogue between Moses and God.
Yeah.
And so one of the, like, as a foundational story, one of the things it reveals to us is God's immanence, God's both transcendence as being powerful enough to send plagues, and God's immanence as being powerful enough and intimate enough to be in relationship with.
Because God needed those people to leave that identical place to go and worship him.
Mhm.
But that place, the people couldn't worship him there. He needed a sanctuary to be built for him to be worshipped. Those identical people that Pharaoh were holding.
Yeah, so God wasn't just liberating just for no reason. God was liberating because because God saw suffering, and because God wanted to be in relationship with the Israelites, like wanted that mutuality of worship and
Redemption.
freedom and redemption. Yes. Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, John.
I had more of a question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like, so.
I look forward to passing that to John Wilson when you ask it. Go ahead.
It's just that Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the Israelites go out of the country. So why is that? Like, is there any thoughts on?
I think that's a really good part of the epic.
It seems
Yeah.
like he's working both sides of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to speak to that?
Oh, great, I get it.
I mean, I have my ideas, but.
Well, we talked a little bit about that in our group too, and I said I didn't use this phrase in our group, but there's something called experience predestination, where you look back on what happened. And you can see that everything the example I gave is if you had to change your flight and then the flight you were on crashed and everybody was killed. You can say, God saved me by, that's experience predestination. It looked like there was, in hindsight, it looks like a plan, where in foresight, it might not have looked that way at all. And I always thought that the ancient Israelites, looking back on what Pharaoh did, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that's why we're here. Even though it didn't look like it at the time. So I'm not sure it's a philosophical argument about whether everything is predestined or whether God is interfering with Pharaoh's mind or something. It's looking, because this is, of course, is a story that's an origin story that was important every time you did the Passover. We were also talking about, we do that with communion every week. You take something you're doing right now and you tie it. You explain what you're doing right now on the basis of a very ancient story. And that's the purpose of this.
Can you hear me?
It's kind of unfortunate to make it a big argument about whether there's predestination. Whether Pharaoh ought to really be blamed when God is the one that hardened his heart. And, I mean, it is interesting. It's not a useless question, but it's not the point of the story. So.
Okay,
I don't think it was predestined, but analytically, I think God knew what was going to be the outcome. So he's the all-medicine God, all-present.
Yeah.
He's the Alpha and Omega.
Well, that's one of life's great mysteries, if God knows everything, then how can anything happen that God doesn't already know is going to happen? I have to counter that by saying yes, but another of the important points in the Bible is that we have free will. We make our choices. Every moment is contingent. Anything could happen next. And those two ideas seem to contradict each other, but I've said to my class many times, I don't mind contradicting myself, so. I think
Paradox is part of it. Okay,
both.
John, I have a closing question for you as we are wrapping up. Knowing something is historical narrative, historical epic specifically, how does that change? How would you summarize the way that changes the way that we should read that text or read that story, understand that story, and interpret it and apply it within our own context today?
Well, part of it is the main point does not become whether the story is true or not. I think that's the first thing. I think for most Bible students, because people sometimes have a lot of even faith problems about saying, is this story true? So I think that historical epics has to be read to say, yes, the story is true. What is the point? You know, what is it that's true about the story? And that's what, and it's an epic because it's dealing with an issue that is so important in our lives. It may even be, why do we have the Passover just like this? Why do we do the Lord's Supper just like this? Or why does life even matter? I mean, it could be a big question, or how did we get it? Any of those kinds of questions that you read it to answer the question that the writer was trying to answer for you, and not some other thing.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thanks for talking about historical epic today. Appreciate it.
I'm doing.
Next week is, I added pretty much everyone. I was pretty good about adding everyone as you walked in. I have a handout for what we're going to study in advance in case anyone would like to do that. Next week is New Testament narrative. So the historical epics in the New Testament, which is the book of Acts. So that's what we're doing next week.